Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change the course of a life forever. In the harsh winter of 1890, a broken cowboy would discover that mercy still walks the earth. Colt Avery, 60 years old with only his loyal donkey and a limp, helps an elderly woman stranded on the trail. Miss Edna Greer, 96 and sharp-minded, shocks the town by signing her entire ranch over to this stranger. Everyone laughs, waiting for him to fail. But as Colt tends the land, mysterious letters surface, a estranged family appears, and an old burned church reveals a hidden truth. What if the ranch wasn't just land, but a divine calling to heal what had been broken for decades? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind carried the promise of snow across the Montana high country, and Colt Avery could smell it coming like he could smell rain in summer. He'd been smelling weather for 40 years, reading the sky the way other men read newspapers. It was a gift that came with living outdoors with trusting your senses more than your comfort. He stood at the edge of Timber Creek, watching Maud drink from the shallow water, her grey coat thick with winter growth. The donkey was 15 years old, maybe older. Colt had lost track after the first decade. She'd been a young Jenny when he'd traded 2 weeks' wages for her, back when he still had wages to trade and a ranch to work on. Now they were both old, both scarred, both making their way through a world that had less and less use for creatures like them. Colt was 60 years old, though he felt older most mornings when his left leg reminded him of the horse that had rolled on him 8 years back. The limp wasn't terrible, but it was enough. Enough to make ranch owners look past him when hiring. Enough to mark him as damaged goods in a profession that prized strength and endurance. Enough to turn him from a working cowboy into a drifter who took odd jobs and slept in barns when folks were feeling charitable. He wore the same clothes he'd worn for 3 seasons, a coat that had once been brown but was now the color of old leather and road dust, patched at the elbows with fabric that didn't quite match. His hat had seen better decades, the brim curved just so from years of being shaped by the same hands. His boots were resoled twice over, the leather cracked but still serviceable. Everything about Colt Avery spoke of a man who had learned to make do, to stretch resources, to find dignity in scarcity. In his coat pocket, wrapped in an old handkerchief, he carried his most precious possession, a small leather Bible, its cover worn smooth by handling, its pages soft as cloth from reading. His mother had given it to him when he'd left home at 17, and it was the only thing that had stayed with him through all the years and all the losses. The spine was broken in 3 places, held together with careful stitching he'd done himself. Certain passages were underlined in faded pencil, verses he'd returned to in times of trouble. "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." He read from it most nights by whatever light he could find. Campfire, lantern, moonlight when he had to. The words had carried him through more darkness than he cared to remember, and he trusted them more than he trusted most men. Maud finished drinking and looked back at him with patient eyes. She knew they needed to move on. The town of Redemption was still 5 miles south, and Colt had heard there might be work there. A merchant needing freight hauled, or a stable needing mucking, or maybe just a charitable soul willing to trade a meal for an hour of labor. It was the kind of hope he lived on now, modest and uncertain, but hope nonetheless. "Come on, girl," he said quietly, and Maud fell into step beside him without needing a lead rope. They'd been together too long for that formality. She knew his moods, his pace, his direction almost before he did. She was companion more than beast of burden, and he talked to her more than he talked to people these days. The trail wound through stands of pine and aspen, the trees already bare of leaves, their white trunks like bones against the grey sky. Colt had been through this country before, years ago when he'd worked the Blackfoot Ranch. That was back when his leg was good and his heart was whole, back when he'd had a wife named Sarah and 2 children who called him Papa. The memories came at him sideways sometimes. catching him off guard, Mary's laugh high and bright, Thomas reaching up to hold his hand, Sarah humming while she kneaded bread. 15 years they'd been gone. 15 years since the fever had swept through the camp where they'd been living. Him working the autumn roundup while Sarah and the children waited in a borrowed cabin. He'd come back to find them all three buried in graves marked with wooden crosses, the camp doctor unable to meet his eyes. The world had gone silent that day, like someone had stuffed cotton in his ears and wrapped his heart in ice. He'd stopped reading his Bible for a while after that. Stopped praying. Stopped believing that God paid much attention to the particulars of suffering. But slowly, painfully, like a bone knitting after a bad break, his faith had returned. Not the easy faith of his youth, but something tougher, more weathered. A faith that could hold both trust and questions, both belief and doubt. The ranches had kept him on for a while after, but his heart wasn't in the work the way it needed to be. He'd grown careless, distracted. Then came the accident with the horse, and the limp, and the slow recognition that he'd become a man without a place. The world was changing anyway. Ranches were shrinking, barbed wire was going up. Railroads were bringing in cattle from distant places. The open range was closing, and men like him, men who'd lived their whole lives following the grass and the seasons, were becoming relics. So he'd learned to drift, town to town, job to job, staying just long enough to earn a few dollars and a hot meal before moving on. He didn't want to become a burden, didn't want to see pity in people's eyes when they looked at him. Pride, maybe, but it was the last thing. He had that felt like it belonged to him alone. The town of redemption came into view as the afternoon light started to fade. A collection of wooden buildings huddled together like they were trying to keep warm. There was a general store, a saloon, a livery, a church with a white steeple, and maybe 24 houses scattered around the main street. Smoke rose from chimneys, and Colt could smell bread baking somewhere, which made his stomach clench with hunger. He stopped at the livery first. The owner, a thick-shouldered man named Garrett, looked him over with the quick assessment of someone who'd sized up drifters before. "Looking for work," Colt said simply. "I'm good with horses, can muck stables, mend tack. Don't drink, don't cause trouble." Garrett scratched his jaw. "Might have something for you. Got 3 stalls need cleaning, and my back ain't what it used to be. Pays 2 bits in a meal. You got a place to sleep? I'll find something. You can bed down in the loft if you don't mind the cold. There's hay up there and it's dry. That'd be fine. Thank you. Your donkey can have the back stall. No charge for that, long as you're working." It was more generosity than Colt had expected, and he felt the familiar wash of gratitude mixed with shame that came with accepting charity. "I appreciate it." He worked until full dark, mucking the stables with steady, methodical movements that his body remembered even when his mind wandered. Maud stood in her stall, content with a measure of oats and clean bedding. When the work was done, Garrett's wife brought him a plate of stew and cornbread, steam rising in the cold air. "You've got kind hands with the animals," she said, watching him through the stable door. Garrett noticed. "We might have more work for you if you're staying." "I might," Colt said. "Haven't decided yet." "Well, you're welcome to stay as long as you work honest. We can always use an extra hand." He ate slowly, savoring each bite, then climbed the ladder to the loft where he spread his bedroll in the hay. The space smelled of dried grass and old wood, not unpleasant. Through the gaps in the boards, he could see the stars beginning to emerge, hard and bright in the cold sky. He pulled out his Bible and opened it by the light of a small lantern Garrett had left him. The pages fell open to a passage he'd marked years ago. In Psalms, "The Lord is close to the broken-hearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." He read the words twice, letting them settle in his chest like warm stones. He'd been broken-hearted and crushed in spirit more times than he could count, and yet here he was, still breathing, still working, still finding small mercies in unexpected places. Maybe that was what faith looked like at 60, not the certainty of answers, but the stubborn persistence of hope. He closed the Bible and tucked it back in his pocket, then blew out the lantern. In the darkness, he could hear Maud shifting in her stall below, the familiar sound a comfort. Tomorrow, he'd see what other work might be available. Maybe he'd stay in Redemption for a while, build up a small reserve of cash before winter hit hard. But even as he thought it, he felt the old restlessness stirring. He'd been moving for so long that stillness felt foreign, like a language he'd once spoken but had mostly forgotten. Some part of him wondered if he'd ever find a place that felt like home again, or if he'd spend the rest of his days as a man passing through. Sleep came slowly, and with it, dreams of Sarah and the children, their faces clear and dear and gone. He woke once in the night, tears on his face, and lay still until the ache subsided. Then he prayed, not for understanding or even comfort, but simply for the strength to face another day. It was a prayer he'd prayed 1,000 times, and God had answered it 1,000 times. That was enough. That had to be enough. When morning came, grey and cold, he climbed down from the loft and found Maud waiting for him. He stroked her neck and she leaned into his hand, warm and solid and real. They'd face the day together the way they always did. "Come on, girl," he said. "Let's see what today brings." He had no idea that 5 miles north, on a trail he'd traveled before the day was done, an elderly woman sat in a broken wagon, praying for help. He had no idea that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't imagine, or that the prayer he'd whispered in the darkness, for strength to face another day, was about to be answered in the most unexpected way possible. All he knew was the familiar weight of his Bible in his pocket, the solid presence of Maud beside him, and the quiet determination to keep moving forward, one step at a time. It was all he'd ever known, and he thought it was all he'd ever have. He was wrong about that. God had other plans. The trail north of Redemption was less traveled, cutting through rolling hills covered in sage and buffalo grass, turned golden by autumn and frosted by the approaching winter. Colt had taken a job delivering supplies to a remote homestead, and Maud carried the small load without complaint, her steady pace eating up the miles. It was mid-afternoon when he saw the wagon. It sat tilted at an awkward angle in a shallow ravine, one wheel clearly broken, the horse still in the traces but standing patient and calm. A figure in dark clothing sat on the wagon seat, unmoving, and for a moment Colt thought he might be approaching a tragedy. Then the figure turned, and he saw it was an elderly woman, her face shadowed by a bonnet, but her posture erect despite her predicament. "Ma'am," he called out, guiding Maud down the slope. "Are you hurt?" "Only my pride, young man." Her voice was strong, edged with dry humor. "And possibly my judgment for taking this shortcut at my age, young man." Colt almost smiled. He was 60 years old, but he supposed to her that might qualify. He dismounted, his legs stiff from the cold, and approached the wagon. The wheel had hit a rock and shattered 2 spokes, leaving the hub cracked. It was beyond roadside repair. "How long have you been here?" "An hour, perhaps 2. I was beginning to think I'd spend the night, which would have been uncomfortable but not fatal. The Lord provides even when we make foolish choices." She looked at him directly, and he was struck by her eyes, pale blue, sharp, missing nothing. "I'm Edna Greer, and you are?" "Colt Avery, ma'am." He touched the brim of his hat. "I can't fix this wheel here, but I can get you home if you'll allow it." "Where do you live?" 3 miles west, at the base of Copper Ridge. The Greer Ranch, perhaps you've heard of it? He had. The Greer Ranch was one of the established properties in the territory, though he'd heard it had fallen on harder times in recent years. He studied the old woman more carefully. Her clothes were well made but worn. Her hands showed the marks of age and work, and there was something in her bearing that spoke of dignity maintained through difficulty. "I can take you there," he said. "We'll need to unhitch your horse and leave the wagon. I can come back tomorrow with proper tools and a new wheel. That's kind of you." She watched as he moved to the horse, his hands sure and gentle as he worked the buckles and straps. "You know your way around a rig." "Been around horses all my life, ma'am." He fashioned a lead rope and brought her horse alongside Maud, then helped Miss Edna down from the wagon seat. She moved stiffly, but refused his arm once her feet were on solid ground. She was tiny, barely 5 feet tall, but she carried herself like a much larger person. "I can walk," she said, "though not quickly. No need to rush." "We have daylight enough?" They made their way west, Colt leading both animals, while Miss Edna walked beside him, her steps small but steady. She was silent for a while, and he respected that, but eventually she spoke. "You have a kind face, Mr. Avery. I've learned to trust faces more than words as I've aged. Words can lie, but faces tell the truth if you know how to read them. I appreciate that, ma'am, though I'm not sure my face has much to recommend it these days. It has honesty, which is rare, and sorrow, which is common but born with grace in your case." She glanced at him. "You've lost people. It wasn't a question." Colt felt his throat tighten, but kept his voice steady. "My wife and children. 15 years ago. I'm sorry. Loss leaves marks that don't fade." She was quiet a moment. "I lost my Samuel 5 years ago. Married 70 years, can you imagine? Sometimes I still set his place at the table by habit. That's a long marriage. You were blessed. We were. Though we had our struggles, like any couple. 3 children, all of them gone now in their own ways, not dead but scattered, angry, distant." Her voice carried old pain. "Samuel tried to be a good father, but he was better at loving God than loving them, if that makes sense. He was a man of great faith and great conviction, and sometimes those things can hurt the people closest to you." Colt understood more than he wanted to. He'd known men like that, good men who loved principles more easily than people, who could show more passion for doctrine than for the daily needs of a child or spouse. I'm sure he did his best. Oh, he did. But best isn't always enough, is it? We learn that the hard way. She shook her head. "Listen to me, unburdening to a stranger. You must think I'm a lonely old woman who talks too much. I think you're a woman who's been carrying things alone for too long." She looked at him with something like surprise, then smiled. It transformed her face, showing the beauty she must have been in youth. "You're perceptive, Mr. Avery, and kind. These are not small things." The ranch came into view as they crested a rise, a sprawling property with good water, rich grassland, and a house that had clearly been built with care decades ago. But Colt could see the signs of neglect: fences needing repair, outbuildings with sagging roofs, fields that should have been worked but stood empty. It was a place sliding slowly into ruin, beautiful but abandoned. "Samuel built all of this," Miss Edna said, following his gaze. 40 years of work, and now I'm 96 years old, alone, watching it fall apart around me. I can't keep it up, and there's no one to pass it to. Your children don't want it. Made that clear years ago." Her voice was matter-of-fact, but he heard the hurt beneath. "They see it as the thing that stole their father from them. And perhaps they're right." They reached the house, and Colt helped her up the steps to the porch. The interior was clean but sparse, the furniture good but old, everything speaking of a life that had once been full and was now emptied out. "Let me start a fire for you," Colt said, moving to the hearth. "And if you'll tell me where, I'll feed the animals. There are still a few horses in the barn. The feed is in the back room." She lowered herself into a chair near the hearth, and he saw how the journey had tired her. "Mr. Avery, would you stay for supper? I have stew that's been simmering, and there's more than I can eat alone." He should refuse, should get back to his delivery, but something in her face stopped him. "I'd be honored, ma'am." He tended the animals, settling them in the barn alongside 3 older horses that had clearly once been working stock. Then he returned to the house where Miss Edna had set the table for 2. They ate together, and she talked about Samuel, about the ranch, about the dreams they'd had, and how life shapes dreams in ways you can't predict. "The land knows who's meant to tend it," she said at one point, her eyes distant. "Samuel used to say that. He believed the land chooses its keeper as much as the keeper chooses the land." Colt didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. As darkness fell, Miss Edna insisted he sleep in the spare room rather than ride back in the cold. He was too tired to argue. He woke to the smell of coffee and found her already dressed, sitting at the kitchen table with papers spread before her. "Mr. Avery," she said as he entered, "I have something to discuss with you." He sat across from her, his Bible a familiar weight in his pocket, and saw that the papers were legal documents. His heart began to beat faster without knowing why. "I've been praying for 3 years, Miss Edna said, asking God to send someone who could tend this land the way it deserves. Someone Samuel would have trusted. She pushed the papers toward him. Yesterday on that trail, I believe my prayer was answered. Colt looked down at the documents. They were deed transfers, signed and witnessed by the town lawyer whose name appeared at the bottom. His name, Colt Avery, was written in careful script as the new owner. Ma'am, I don't understand. I'm signing my ranch over to you. All of it. The land, the buildings, the remaining stock. It's yours. The words hung in the air like something physical. Colt stared at her, then at the papers, then back at her. Ma'am, I can't accept this. You don't know me. I helped you because it was the right thing to do, not because I wanted— I know. Her voice was gentle but firm. That's exactly why I'm doing this. You helped because it was right, not for gain. That's the kind of man this land needs. But your children will be provided for in other ways. They don't want the ranch, Mr. Avery. They've made that abundantly clear. She placed her hand over his, her skin papery and thin, but her grip surprisingly strong. Please, this is what Samuel wanted. What I want. The land knows its keeper, and you're the one who's meant to be here. Colt's mind reeled. A ranch, a home, security he hadn't known in 15 years. It was impossible, too much, too good. I don't deserve this, he whispered. None of us deserve grace, Mr. Avery. That's why it's called grace. She held out a pen. His hand shook as he took it. 2 hours later, after the lawyer had come and gone, after the papers were signed and filed and witnessed, Colt stood at the ranch boundary with the deed in his hand. Maud stood beside him, and the morning sun was breaking through the clouds, casting long shadows across the land that was now his. He looked at the paper, at his name written there in ink that couldn't be erased. Colt Avery, owner. It felt like a dream, like something that would dissolve when he woke. But it was real. As real as the Bible in his pocket, as real as the cold wind on his face. What did I just do, girl? He murmured to Maud. She had no answer, but her presence was steady beside him. He thought of Miss Edna's words. The land knows its keeper, and for the first time in 15 years, Colt Avery felt something he'd almost forgotten. The stirring of hope that maybe, just maybe, he'd finally come home. The house felt enormous after years of sleeping in barns and under stars. Colt walked through it that first afternoon like a man in a stranger's home, afraid to touch anything, uncertain where he belonged. 3 bedrooms upstairs, a parlor, a kitchen with a cast-iron stove, a dining room with a table that could seat 8. The furniture was covered with dustcloths, giving everything a ghostly quality, and his footsteps echoed on the wooden floors. He chose the smallest bedroom for himself, the one that faced east, so he'd wake with the sun. He couldn't bring himself to take the master bedroom. That felt like too much presumption, even with the deed in his possession. He unpacked his few belongings, an extra shirt, his razor, a small tin of coffee, and the Bible that never left his pocket unless he was reading it. Maud had settled into the barn without hesitation, as if she'd been born to the place. Colt envied her certainty. By the second day, word had spread through Redemption. When he rode into town to buy supplies, he felt eyes following him everywhere. The conversation stopped when he approached, then resumed in whispers when he passed. At the general store, the clerk was polite but cool, counting his change twice as if suspecting him of something. On the 3rd day, they came. Colt was in the yard, taking stock of the fencing that needed repair, when he heard horses approaching. 5 men rode up, led by a heavy-set man in a banker's suit. They didn't dismount, staying in their saddles, a deliberate choice meant to put him at a disadvantage, to force him to look up at them. "You're Avery?" the banker asked, though he clearly knew the answer. "I am. I'm Herbert Dalton, president of Redemption Bank. These men are concerned citizens." He gestured to the others, a merchant, 2 ranchers, and the owner of the livery where Colt had worked. Garrett wouldn't meet his eyes. "We've heard some disturbing news about you taking advantage of an elderly woman." Colt felt heat rise in his chest, but he kept his voice level. "I didn't take advantage of anyone. Miss Edna signed her property over to me of her own free will, with a lawyer present, an elderly woman of 96. possibly not in full possession of her faculties. Her faculties are sharper than yours. Mr. Dalton. Colt's tone was quiet but firm. She knew exactly what she was doing. Did she? One of the ranchers leaned forward. Or did you spin her some tale, play on her loneliness, convince her to give you what her own children should inherit? Her children didn't want it. The words came out harder than Colt intended. She told me so herself. This ranch has been dying for 5 years, and not one of them came to help her. That's family business, Dalton said. Not yours. It became my business when she made it so. Colt met each man's gaze in turn. I understand how this looks. A drifter shows up and suddenly owns a ranch. I'd be suspicious too. But I didn't ask for this. I helped a woman on the trail because it was the right thing to do. What she did after was her choice, not my scheme. Pretty convenient story. It's the truth. Colt's hands hung loose at his sides, not threatening, but ready. He'd learned long ago that some confrontations needed to be faced head-on. If Miss Edna wants to revoke the deed, she can. If her children want to challenge it legally, they can try. But until then, this is my land, legally given and legally owned. The silence stretched. Finally, Dalton spoke again, his voice colder. We'll be watching you, Avery. One misstep, one sign you're taking advantage, and we'll make sure you regret it. Fair enough. They rode away, and Colt stood in the yard until they were out of sight. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from anger and shame. He'd done nothing wrong, but he felt dirty anyway, as if their suspicions had left a stain he couldn't wash off. He went back to work with a furious energy, throwing himself into the physical labor of repairing fences until his leg ached and his hands were raw. The work helped, but it couldn't silence the voices in his head, the ones that agreed with the townspeople, the ones that said he didn't deserve this, that he was an imposter playing at being a rancher. The days fell into a pattern. He woke at dawn, fed the animals, worked the land until dark, then collapsed into bed too tired to think. The ranch revealed its neglect slowly. Rotted fence posts, a leaking roof on the barn, fields choked with weeds, irrigation ditches filled with debris. 5 years of abandonment couldn't be undone in weeks, but Colt worked steadily, methodically, checking items off a mental list that seemed to grow longer every day. He found the brand iron on his second week, half buried in the dirt floor of the barn's tack room. He'd been clearing out old equipment when his boot struck something solid. He dug it out and brushed off the dust, revealing a heavy iron brand with an unusual design. Not the typical letters or simple shapes, but a cross with curved ends, almost like a Celtic knot. The Greer cross, he'd learned later. Samuel's design, chosen because he'd said the ranch would be built on faith as much as hard work. Colt held the brand in both hands, feeling its weight, imagining Samuel heating it in the forge and pressing it into the hide of newborn calves. It was a mark of ownership, of legacy, of belonging. He set it on the workbench, unable to decide if he had any right to use it. That night, alone in the house with lamplight flickering against the walls, Colt felt the full weight of his solitude. The house was too big, too empty, too full of ghosts. He could almost hear the echo of the family that had lived here. Children's laughter, Samuel's deep voice, Edna's footsteps in the kitchen. He was an intruder in their space, a stranger wearing borrowed clothes. He pulled out his Bible and opened it to the Psalms, the pages falling naturally to the passages he'd read most often. Cast your burden on the Lord, and he will sustain you. He read the words 3 times, trying to believe them, trying to feel something other than overwhelming inadequacy. A knock at the door startled him. He opened it to find Miss Edna standing on the porch, wrapped in a heavy shawl, her sister's buggy waiting in the yard. Miss Edna, what are you doing here at this hour? May I come in? I won't stay long. He stepped aside and she entered, looking around the room with eyes that saw past and present simultaneously. It feels strange to be a visitor in my own home, she said, but there was no bitterness in her voice. Though I suppose it's your home now, it doesn't feel like mine. It will. Give it time. She moved to the fireplace where the brand iron now sat on the mantel. She touched it with one finger. You found Samuel's mark? In the barn. I wasn't sure what to do with it. Use it. That's what it's for. She turned to face him. "Mr. Avery, I know the town has been unkind. Herbert Dalton came to see me, suggesting I'd lost my wits. I'm sorry, don't be. I told him exactly what I thought of his presumption." She smiled slightly. "The advantage of being 96 is that you stop caring what people think. I said what I meant, and I meant what I said. This ranch is yours. Why?" The question burst out of him. "Why me? You could have sold it, could have forced your children to take it, could have left it to the church. Why give it to a drifter you met on the trail?" She was quiet for a long moment, her pale eyes studying him. "Samuel left instructions," she said finally. "Letters, actually. Sealed envelopes with specific directions for after his death. One of them said I would know the right person when they came, that I should trust what God laid on my heart." She reached out and patted his arm. "You were the answer to a prayer, Mr. Avery. Don't question that too hard. But what if I fail? What if I can't make this work? Then you'll have tried, which is more than most people do." She moved toward the door and he followed. "Samuel used to say that God doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the called. You're here for a reason, even if you can't see it yet." After she left, Colt stood on the porch and watched the buggy disappear into the darkness. Her words echoed in his mind. You're here for a reason. He wanted to believe it, wanted to trust that there was purpose in this unexpected gift, that he wasn't just a convenient solution to an old woman's problem. But belief didn't come easy, not anymore. Faith had to be rebuilt, brick by brick, like the fences he was repairing. He went back inside and looked at the brand iron on the mantel. The Greer cross, a mark of faith and legacy. Maybe Miss Edna was right. Maybe he was meant to use it, to carry forward what Samuel had started. He didn't know if he was worthy of that responsibility. But standing there in the lamplight, in the house that was now his home, he made a quiet decision. He would prove himself worthy, not to the town, not even to Miss Edna, but to the trust that had been placed in him. He would work this land with everything he had. He would honor the legacy he'd been given, and if God truly had brought him here, then God would have to give him the strength to see it through. He picked up the brand iron, feeling its solid weight in his hands, and carried it back to the barn. Tomorrow he would clean it properly, prepare it for use. Tomorrow he would continue the work of restoration. Tonight he would simply be grateful for a roof over his head, for Maud content in her stall, for the unexpected mercy that had brought him to this place. It was enough. It had to be enough. 6 weeks into his new life, Colt had established rhythms that felt almost normal. He woke before sunrise, fed the animals, checked fences, worked on whatever project demanded attention that day. The list of repairs seemed endless, but he was making progress. The barn roof was patched, 2 paddocks were rebuilt, the irrigation ditches were cleared. His hands developed new calluses and his leg ached, less as the work strengthened muscles he'd let go soft. During his drifting years, he was mending fence on the eastern boundary when a rider approached, a man in his 50s with a weathered face and sharp eyes, sitting his horse with the easy confidence of someone born to the saddle. "You'd be Avery," the man said. "Not making it a question. I am, Dutch Morrison. I own the property east of here." He dismounted and walked over to examine Colt's work on the fence. "Not bad. You know what you're doing. Been working ranches most of my life." "So I heard." Dutch pulled out tobacco and papers, rolling a cigarette with practiced ease. "Also heard you sweet-talked old Miss Edna into giving you her land." Colt straightened, meeting the other man's gaze. "That what you heard?" "That's what some folks say." Dutch lit the cigarette and took a long drag. "I don't believe it, though. I knew Samuel Greer and I know Edna. She's got more sense in her little finger than most men have in their whole body. If she gave you this place, she had her reasons." The tension in Colt's shoulders eased slightly. "I appreciate that. Don't thank me yet. I'm not here to be friendly. I'm here to see if you're going to be a good neighbor or a problem." Dutch gestured at the ranch. "This property shares water rights with mine. I need to know you'll respect that." "I will. And I need to know you're going to work the land proper, not let it go to waste." "That's my intention." Dutch studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right. I believe you." He offered his hand and Colt shook it. "You need help with anything, you let me know. I can't give you labor, I got my own place to run, but I can give advice. I'd welcome it. They talked for an hour, standing by the fence while Dutch shared information about the land, the water, the challenges of ranching in this particular valley. As the conversation went on, he began to reveal more about the Greers. Samuel was a complicated man, Dutch said. Good man, don't mistake me, but complicated. He had strong faith, strong convictions. Built a church for the community about 10 miles north, paid for it himself, organized work crews, made sure every family in the valley had a place to worship. That's generous. It was. But it also took time away from his family. His kids grew up seeing their father more passionate about saving other people's souls than about being home for supper. Dutch flicked ash from his cigarette. His oldest boy, Thomas, used to complain that the ranch was just a means to fund Samuel's charity. Said his father would give the shirt off his back to a stranger, but couldn't spare an hour to teach his own son to read. That must have been hard. It was. All 3 kids left as soon as they were old enough. Thomas went east, became a banker in Chicago. Margaret married a merchant and moved to Denver. Rebecca went to San Francisco, works as a school teacher. They come back for funerals and not much else. Colt thought of his own children, gone before they could grow up and leave him. He'd never had the chance to fail them, the way Samuel had failed his. The thought brought both grief and strange relief. Samuel tried to make amends, Dutch continued. Last years of his life, he wrote letters to them, tried to explain. I don't think they ever answered. He died still hoping they'd come home. That's a hard way to go. It is. Dutch dropped his cigarette and ground it under his heel. But Samuel believed God had a plan, even for his failures. Kept saying the ranch would serve a greater purpose someday. I never knew what he meant by that. He looked at Colt directly. Maybe you're part of that purpose. The words settled on Colt like a weight. He didn't know how to respond, so he just nodded. After Dutch left, Colt returned to the house and found himself drawn to Samuel's study, a small room off the parlor that he'd mostly avoided. It felt too intimate, too much like trespassing, to sit at another man's desk and read his private thoughts. But Dutch's words had stirred his curiosity. The desk drawers were unlocked. Inside, he found account books, correspondence, and a stack of leather journals. He opened one at random and saw Samuel's handwriting, neat and precise, dated 15 years ago. I fear I've lost Thomas, Samuel had written. He looks at me with such disappointment these days. He wanted a father who would teach him ranching, who would spend evenings by the fire telling stories. Instead, he got a father obsessed with building a church, with saving souls I don't even know. How do I explain that I see Christ in the face of every stranger? How do I make him understand that loving God means loving his people? But perhaps I'm wrong. Perhaps loving God should start with loving the family he gave me. I pray for wisdom, but the answer seems to slip through my fingers like water. Colt read page after page, moved by the raw honesty of Samuel's struggle. Here was a man who loved deeply but imperfectly, who tried to serve God but wounded his children in the process. The journals were full of prayers for reconciliation, questions about purpose, doubts about whether his choices had been right. In the back of one journal, Colt found a gold pocket watch, tarnished with age. Engraved on the case were words that made his throat tighten. Time is God's gift. Use it wisely. SG, he held the watch, feeling the weight of irony. Samuel had understood the value of time, but had spent it poorly when it came to his own children. And now here Colt sat, reading the regrets of a dead man, holding a watch that marked time that couldn't be recovered. He wound the watch and held it to his ear. It still worked, ticking steadily, a small miracle of survival. That night, the first major snowstorm of winter struck. Colt woke to howling wind and temperatures dropping fast. He pulled on his coat and boots and stumbled to the barn, where he found several cattle huddled near the door, their breath steaming in the cold. They'd broken through a weak section of fence, and now they were in danger of freezing. He worked for hours in the driving snow, herding the cattle into the barn, reinforcing the fence, checking on the other animals. His fingers went numb, his face burned with cold, and his legs screamed in protest. He was on the edge of giving up when he heard a voice. "Need help?" Dutch Morrison emerged from the white curtain of snow, leading his horse. He didn't ask questions, just tied his mount and joined Colt in the work. Together they got the remaining cattle secured, patched the fence well enough to hold, and made sure all the animals had feed and water. In the barn, shaking with cold and exhaustion, Colt tried to thank him. "Don't," Dutch said. "That's what neighbors do. You'd do the same for me." "I would. I know. That's why I'm here." Dutch clapped him on the shoulder. "You're going to make it, Avery. I wasn't sure at first, but you've got what it takes." After Dutch left, Colt stood in the barn with Maud and the other animals, listening to the storm rage outside. He was exhausted, cold, and his body hurt in places he'd forgotten existed. But he'd saved the herd. He'd done the work. And for the first time since taking ownership of the ranch, he felt like he might actually belong here. The next Sunday, Reverend Michaels came to visit. He was an older man with kind eyes and a quiet manner, the kind of pastor who listened more than he preached. They sat in the parlor drinking coffee while the Reverend talked about Samuel. "He was one of the finest men I've known," Michaels said. "Flawed, certainly, but deeply faithful. He believed that his ranch was meant for more than just raising cattle. He used to say that the land was God's classroom, that working it taught patience, humility, dependence on grace." Dutch mentioned he built a church. He did. Beautiful building, served the whole valley. Fire took it about 7 years ago. Lightning strike during a summer storm. Samuel was devastated. He wanted to rebuild, but never had the resources. The community scattered to other churches after that. Michaels looked at Colt thoughtfully. Samuel believed the church would be rebuilt someday. He said God would provide the means and the man. Colt felt the familiar weight settling on him again. He seemed to believe a lot of things about the future. He had a prophetic spirit. Sometimes annoying, if I'm honest. He'd speak with such certainty about things that seemed impossible. But he was right more often than not. The Reverend set down his cup. "I don't know why Edna chose you, Mr. Avery, but I don't think it was random. Samuel prayed over this land for 40 years. Those prayers don't just disappear." After the Reverend left, Colt sat alone with Samuel's pocket watch in his hand, feeling the steady tick against his palm. Time is God's gift. Use it wisely. He thought about his own time. 15 years spent drifting, running from grief, avoiding connection. Had that been time wasted or time needed? He didn't know. But he knew this. He'd been given a second chance at something resembling a life. Whatever the cost, whatever the expectations, he owed it to the trust placed in him to make the most of it. He wound the watch and set it on the mantel beside the brand iron. 2 symbols of legacy, waiting to be claimed. Outside, the storm had passed, and the world was white and clean and new. Colt stood at the window and looked out at the ranch, his ranch, and felt something shift inside him. Not confidence, not yet, but possibility. The sense that maybe, just maybe, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Time would tell. And time, as Samuel had known, was God's gift to use wisely. Spring arrived slowly, melting the snow in patches and turning the ranch into a landscape of mud and new grass. Colt had survived his first winter as a landowner, and the ranch was beginning to show signs of recovery. Fences stood straight. The barn was weather-tight. And the few cattle he'd managed to keep alive looked healthier with each passing week. He was working on the barn foundation, replacing rotted timbers when his pry bar struck something that wasn't wood or stone. He cleared away the dirt and debris to reveal a small metal box wedged into the cornerstone. His heart quickened as he pulled it free and brushed off the rust. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture, was a sealed envelope. The writing on the front made him catch his breath. "To the one who comes after." Colt sat back on his heels, the envelope trembling slightly in his hands. This was meant for him. Samuel had hidden it here. Somehow knowing that someone would come, someone would find it. Someone would need whatever message it contained. He opened it carefully and unfolded the letter inside. "If you're reading this," Samuel had written, "then my prayers have been answered. God has sent someone to tend this land and complete what I could not finish. I don't know your name, friend, but I know your heart. You're someone who understands failure and grace, loss and redemption. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. I've made mistakes. I loved God more obviously than I loved my children, and that was wrong. I gave my money to strangers while my own family felt neglected, and that was wrong. I built a church for the community, but couldn't build peace in my own home, and that was wrong. But I have to believe, that even our mistakes can be used for good if we surrender them. The ranch, the church, the land itself, they're all part of something larger than I could see. Something you'll need to see clearly. Enclosed is a map. Follow the old mission trail north through the pine forest. You'll know the place when you reach it. There you'll find what I left for the one who comes after. Trust the timing. Trust the call. Trust that you're exactly where you're meant to be. May God give you wisdom and strength for what lies ahead. Samuel Greer. Colt read the letter 3 times, each word sinking deeper. He unfolded the map, hand-drawn, showing the ranch and surrounding territory. A trail was marked in ink, leading north through the forest to a spot marked simply with a cross, the burned church. It had to be. He studied the map for hours that night, tracing the route by lamplight, trying to understand what Samuel wanted him to find. But the more he looked, the more questions arose. What had Samuel left there? Why the mystery? And what did it have to do with him? The questions consumed him. He found himself distracted during work, his mind constantly returning to the letter and the map. He read Samuel's journals more carefully, looking for clues. He questioned Dutch about the church, about Samuel's later years, about anything that might explain the cryptic message. Samuel got more mystical as he aged, Dutch told him. Started talking about visions and divine plans. Some folks thought he was losing his mind. I thought he was just seeing past what the rest of us could see. The ranch was thriving under Colt's care, but his mind was elsewhere. Maud seemed to sense his distraction, nudging him gently when he stood staring at nothing. He knew he needed to follow the map, to see what Samuel had left for him, but something held him back. Maybe fear. Maybe the sense that once he followed that trail, everything would change again. He was in the yard, working on a new corral, when the rider appeared. Colt knew who it was before the man dismounted. There was something in the way he sat his horse, the set of his shoulders, that spoke of authority and resentment in equal measure. "You're Avery." It wasn't a question. The man was perhaps 68, well-dressed in Eastern style, with iron-gray hair and eyes that held no warmth. "I'm Thomas Greer. This is my family's ranch you're squatting on." Colt set down his tools and wiped his hands on his pants. "Mr. Greer, I've been expecting someone from the family to come. Have you?" Thomas dismounted and stood with his hands on his hips, looking around at the improvements Colt had made. "Been making yourself comfortable, I see. I've been doing the work that needed doing, work that should have been done by family. If a stranger hadn't manipulated my mother into signing away her property." Thomas's voice was cold, controlled anger. "I want to know exactly how you convinced a 96-year-old woman to give you everything my father worked 40 years to build." Colt felt his own anger rise, but kept it in check. "I helped her when her wagon broke down. I didn't ask for anything. She offered me the ranch of her own free will, with a lawyer present and everything legal. Legal doesn't mean right. My mother is elderly, lonely, vulnerable. You saw an opportunity and took it. That's not what happened. Then what did happen? A drifter with nothing to his name suddenly owns a ranch worth thousands of dollars because he helped fix a wagon wheel." Thomas stepped closer. "I'm not a fool, Avery. I know a con when I see one. I'm not—" Colt stopped, took a breath. "Mr. Greer, I understand your anger. If I were in your position, I'd feel the same way. But your mother made a choice. She said your family didn't want the ranch, that it held too many painful memories. She had no right to make that choice without consulting us. Maybe not. But she did." Colt met Thomas's gaze steadily. "If you want the ranch back, if your family wants to challenge the deed, I won't fight it. I'll sign it back over right now if that's what you think is right." Thomas blinked, clearly not expecting that response. "You'd just give it up?" "I would. I didn't come here to take something from your family. I came here because your mother asked me to, because she believed it was what your father would have wanted. But if I'm wrong, if this is causing more harm than good, then I'll leave." The words hung between them. Thomas stared at him, suspicion warring with confusion. Thomas started, then stopped. "Why would you do that?" "Because it's not worth destroying a family over land. I've lost family, Mr. Greer. I know what that cost feels like. I won't be the reason you lose yours." Before Thomas could respond, another voice called from the road. "Thomas Samuel Greer, what are you doing on this property?" They both turned to see a buggy approaching, driven by Edna's sister but carrying Edna herself, sitting upright and fierce despite her age. "Mother," Thomas's voice lost some of its steel. "I came to discuss the situation with Mr. Avery by accusing him of being a thief and a con artist." Edna climbed down from the buggy with her sister's help, then waved away further assistance as she walked toward them. "I heard you from the road. Your voice carries, Thomas. It always has. He has no right to this land. He has every right. I gave it to him freely, legally, and with full knowledge of what I was doing." Edna stopped in front of her son, and despite the difference in their heights, she seemed to tower over him. "Where were you the last 5 years, Thomas? Where were you when I needed help with the cattle, the repairs, the endless work of keeping this place from falling apart? I have a life in Chicago, and I had a life here. A life that needed my children, but none of you came. Not you, not Margaret, not Rebecca. You all stayed away because you couldn't forgive your father for being human and imperfect. He chose the church over his family. He chose to serve God the best way he knew how. And yes, he failed you in the process. He knew it. He regretted it. He died hoping you'd forgive him, but you never gave him that chance." Edna's voice shook with emotion. "And now you come here, after he's gone, after I've finally found someone willing to work this land, and you dare to accuse him of wrongdoing?" Thomas's face had gone pale. "Mother, your father left letters for each of you. I've kept them for 5 years, waiting for one of you to come home so I could give them to you. But you never came, Thomas. None of you did." She pulled an envelope from her pocket and held it out. "Here, read what your father wanted to say to you. Then decide if you want to keep fighting over land or start rebuilding what was broken." Thomas took the letter with shaking hands. He stared at it for a long moment, then at his mother, then at Colt. "I need time," he said finally. "Take all the time you need," Edna replied. "But don't come back to this ranch with accusations and anger. If you come back, come with an open heart. That's what your father would have wanted." Thomas mounted his horse without another word and rode away. The letter clutched in his hand. After he was gone, Edna turned to Colt. "I'm sorry you had to endure that. It's understandable. I'd feel the same in his position. You're a gracious man, Mr. Avery, more gracious than my son, I'm afraid." She sighed. "This is going to get harder before it gets easier. The other children will come, and they'll have their own pain to work through. Maybe I should step aside. Give the ranch back to the family. Let them work this out without a stranger in the middle. You're not a stranger. You're the answer to a prayer." She patted his arm. "Trust that even when it's difficult." After she left, Colt stood alone in the yard, the evening shadows growing long. He felt caught between worlds, between what he'd been given and what seemed right, between moving forward and stepping back. He returned to the house and took out Samuel's letter and map. The old mission trail, the burned church, whatever waited there might provide answers, or at least clarity. He spread the map on the table and traced the route with his finger. Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow he would follow the trail and see what Samuel had left for the one who comes after, maybe. Then he'd understand what he was truly meant to do. Dawn broke cold and clear as Colt saddled one of the ranch horses, a steady gelding named Buck, and prepared for the journey north. Maud insisted on coming, trotting alongside without being asked, and Colt didn't have the heart to refuse her. They'd been through too much together to separate now. The old mission trail was barely visible, overgrown with brush and young trees, but Samuel's map was detailed enough to guide them. They climbed steadily through pine forest that grew denser as they ascended, the air growing thinner and colder. Colt could see why the trail had been abandoned. It was too steep for wagons, too remote for regular travel. Only someone determined would have used this path, and Samuel had been nothing if not determined. After 3 hours of riding, the forest opened into a clearing, and Colt's breath caught. The church stood, or what remained of it stood, like a skeleton against the sky. The roof was gone, the walls partially collapsed, but the basic structure remained recognizable. What struck him most was the crossbeam above, where the entrance had been. Charred black, split down the middle, it still spanned the width of the doorway. Refusing to fall, despite years of weather and decay, Colt dismounted and walked forward slowly, feeling as if he were approaching sacred ground. The burned wood crunched under his boots and birds scattered from the ruins, but otherwise the place was utterly silent. Not a peaceful silence, something heavier, more profound. The kind of silence that demanded respect. He stood in what had been the sanctuary, looking up at the open sky where the roof should have been. Pews were reduced to charred fragments. The altar was a pile of blackened stone, but the crossbeam remained, a dark testament to both destruction and endurance. Without planning to, Colt found himself on his knees. Memories came flooding back, memories he usually kept carefully locked away. Sarah's face the day he'd proposed, her smile bright with joy. Mary learning to walk, her tiny hands gripping his fingers. Thomas taking his first steps, falling, laughing, getting up again. The cabin where they'd lived, humble but full of love. The morning he'd ridden out for the autumn roundup, Sarah calling after him to be safe, the children waving goodbye. And then the return, the silence, the graves. The earth freshly turned. He'd stopped believing after that. Not in God's existence, that would have been easier, but in God's goodness. He'd raged at the heavens, demanded answers, received only silence. For 3 years he'd carried his Bible but never opened it, a talisman of a faith he'd lost. The church ruins seemed to understand. They spoke of faith tested by fire, of structures that stood despite being broken, of something holy that persisted even in destruction. This place had been built with love and prayer, had burned through no fault of its own, yet the crossbeam still stood. Like faith itself, scarred, broken, but refusing to fall. Colt didn't know how long he knelt there, but when he finally rose, his cheeks were wet, and his heart felt lighter than it had in years. He'd needed to see this place, needed to know that brokenness didn't mean worthlessness, that things burned could still be sacred. He explored the ruins more carefully and found evidence that Samuel had visited regularly. A small clearing near the back showed signs of maintenance, weeds cleared, a path kept open. Against the one intact wall, protected from weather by an overhanging ledge, stood a stone cairn. Colt carefully dismantled the stones and found another metal box, similar to the one in the barn. Inside were more letters, these addressed to no one in particular. Dated over the last 5 years of Samuel's life, he sat on a fallen timber and began to read. "I come here every week," Samuel had written in the first letter. "This place of ruin reminds me that God can work through our failures. The church burned, but the faith didn't die. My children left, but my love for them didn't die. Everything can burn except what matters most. I have a vision, clear as any I've ever received. Someone will come after me, someone who understands loss and redemption. They'll restore this church, but more than that, they'll restore what was broken in my family. The land and the church are connected, you see. Both need healing. Both need someone who can see past the ruins to what could be. I don't know if I'll live to see it. But I believe it with everything I am. God doesn't waste anything, not our suffering, not our mistakes, not even our failures. He weaves them into something we can't yet see." The subsequent letters tracked Samuel's health decline, his growing urgency to prepare for whoever would come after. He'd made plans, drawn maps, written instructions. He'd met with lawyers, set up provisions, prayed constantly for God to send the right person. The last letter, dated a month before his death, was the most haunting. "I'm dying. The doctor says weeks at most. My children won't come. I've written to them, but they're too angry still. I don't blame them. I earned their anger through my choices. But I pray they'll find forgiveness someday, not for my sake, but for their own. Unforgiveness is a weight that crushes the soul. Whoever reads this, restore the church. Bring my children home. Help them see that love can persist even when imperfectly expressed. The ranch is just land, but what it represents, family, faith, legacy, hope, that's everything. You're not here by accident. Trust that. When doubt comes, and it will, remember this place. Remember that what burns can still stand. Remember that God specializes in restoration. Do what I couldn't do. Heal what I broke. I believe you can because God sent you. Colt folded the letters with trembling hands. The weight of expectation was crushing. How was he supposed to restore a burned church? How was he supposed to heal a fractured family? He was just a drifter who'd helped an old woman on a trail. He had no special gifts, no particular wisdom. But even as the doubts crowded in, he looked at the crossbeam, still standing, still bearing witness. Something about it steadied him. If charred wood could stand for 7 years through Montana winters and blazing summers, then maybe a broken man could stand long enough to do what needed doing. He gathered the letters and returned them to the box, then rebuilt the cairn. He'd come back here, he decided. This would be a place of pilgrimage for him, a reminder when faith faltered. The ride back to the ranch took longer. The trail was easier to see going down, but Colt was in no hurry. His mind was full of Samuel's vision, turning it over, examining it from every angle. Restore the church, reunite the family, heal old wounds. It seemed impossible. But then, so had everything else that had happened in the past months. He reached the ranch as the sun was setting, gold light spilling across the valley. The house looked warm and welcoming, smoke rising from the chimney where he'd banked the fire that morning. It struck him how much it had begun to feel like home, not just a place he was staying, but a place he belonged. A buggy stood in the yard. His heart sank, then steadied. Another Greer child. It had to be. He was right. A woman waited on the porch, perhaps 65, with her mother's sharp eyes but a softer expression. She wore traveling clothes and held herself with quiet dignity. "Mr. Avery?" she said as he dismounted. "I'm Margaret Greer Patterson. Thomas wrote to me about you. Mrs. Patterson." Colt climbed the steps carefully, his leg aching from the ride. "Would you like to come inside?" "I would, thank you." Over coffee, Margaret revealed that Thomas had sent her his father's letter and urged her to come see the situation for herself. Unlike her brother, she wasn't angry, just sad, confused, and curious about the stranger who'd inherited her childhood home. "Thomas said you offered to give the ranch back," she said, studying him over her cup. "That's not what a con artist would do." "I'm not a con artist, ma'am. Just a man trying to do right by a trust that was given to me. Why did my mother choose you?" Colt thought about how to answer, then decided on simple honesty. "I think because I had nothing to gain except everything. I think because I understood loss and was still standing anyway. I think because your father prayed for someone like me, and your mother believed God answered." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "My father prayed for a lot of things that never came true. Maybe they just took longer than he expected. They talked for hours, and Margaret proved easier to talk to than her brother. She shared memories of her father, both good and painful, and slowly revealed the depth of hurt that had driven her away. Samuel had missed her wedding because he was organizing a fundraiser for a family whose house had burned. He'd forgotten her birthday multiple times because he was counseling troubled parishioners. He'd promised to visit her in Denver countless times, but always had reasons why he couldn't. "I know he loved me," she said finally, "but it didn't feel like it. And now he's gone, and I can't tell him how much that hurt, and I can't hear him apologize, and I'm just stuck." "He left letters," Colt said gently. "Your mother has them." "Maybe that's a start." Margaret left as darkness fell, promising to return with her husband in a few days. She was softer than Thomas, but no less wounded. Colt could see the long road ahead, 3 damaged children, years of hurt, and the impossible task of bringing them together. That night, he sat by the fire with Samuel's pocket watch in one hand and the memory of the charred crossbeam in his mind. An idea was forming, audacious and terrifying. He would call the family together, all 3 children. He'd show them their father's letters, the church ruins, the vision Samuel had for restoration. He'd ask them, not demand, but ask, to consider healing what had been broken. It might fail, probably would fail. But he had to try, because that's what the crossbeam taught him. You don't have to be whole to stand. You just have to refuse to fall. He pulled out paper and began writing letters to Thomas, Margaret, and Rebecca, inviting them to the ranch in 2 weeks' time. He chose his words carefully, making no demands, expressing no judgment. Just an invitation to hear what their father wanted them to know. When he finished, he sealed the letters and set them aside for morning mailing. Then he opened his Bible to a passage he'd avoided for years. From Isaiah, "I will restore to you the years that the swarming locust has eaten." He read it 3 times, then closed the book and sat in the firelight, praying for the first time in years with something like hope. Restore, heal, rebuild. Maybe, just maybe, it was possible after all. They came separately, but arrived within an hour of each other on the appointed day. Thomas rode in first, sitting his horse with the same rigid posture he'd had during their first meeting. Margaret arrived by buggy with her husband, a quiet man who seemed content to stay in the background. Rebecca came last, driving herself in a small wagon, and Colt was struck by how much she resembled her mother, small, fierce-eyed, with an air of barely contained emotion. The 3 siblings stood in the ranch yard, seeing each other for the first time in over 20 years. The silence was profound and uncomfortable. Thomas nodded curtly to his sisters. Margaret's eyes welled with tears. Rebecca looked at the ground. "Thank you for coming," Colt said, breaking the tension. "Please come inside." He'd prepared the dining room, setting out coffee and the small meal he'd managed to cook. They sat around the table where Samuel had once gathered his family, and the ghosts of better times seemed to hover in the corners. "I know this is difficult," Colt began, "being here together after so long, but I think your father wanted this." "Needed this?" He placed the metal boxes on the table, the one from the barn, the one from the church. "I found these. Letters your father left for whoever came after him. I've read them, and I think you should too." He distributed copies he'd made, watching their faces as they read. Thomas's expression grew harder with each line. Margaret openly wept. Rebecca's hand shook, but her face remained composed. "This is manipulative," Thomas said finally, his voice tight. "Even from the grave, he's trying to control us, or trying to reach us," Rebecca said quietly. It was the first time she'd spoken. "Maybe there's a difference. He had no right. He had every right." Margaret's voice was thick with tears. "He was our father. He made mistakes, terrible mistakes, but he loved us. These letters prove that. These letters prove he felt guilty. That's not the same as love." Colt let them argue, sensing they needed to. Decades of suppressed pain was surfacing, and it had to come out before any healing could begin. He waited until they'd exhausted themselves, then spoke quietly. "There's more. I took the trail your father mapped out. I found the church ruins. I found more letters there." He shared the contents, Samuel's vision for restoration, his belief that someone would come who could heal what he'd broken. He believed God had a plan even for his failures. Plans. Thomas laughed bitterly. "My father always had plans, grand visions, divine callings, and his family always came second to those plans." "You're right," Colt said, surprising them all. "Your father failed you. He put his vision of serving God ahead of the daily work of loving you well. That was wrong, and it caused real harm. But he knew it. These letters show he knew it." "Knowing isn't enough," Thomas said. "No," Colt agreed. "But it's a start." Before anyone could respond, they heard horses approaching. Colt looked out to see a buggy bearing the town lawyer, Mr. Henderson, with Edna beside him. His stomach tightened. This wasn't planned. They came inside, Henderson carrying a leather satchel. Edna looked frailer than Colt had seen her, but her eyes were alert and determined. "Forgive the interruption," Henderson said, but Mrs. Greer felt this was the appropriate time to share certain information. He removed documents from his satchel and laid them on the table. "There are additional provisions to the ranch deed that Mr. Avery was not initially made aware of." Colt's blood ran cold. "Additional provisions?" "A codicil, drafted by Samuel Greer 5 years ago and witnessed by myself and 2 others. Mrs. Greer was instructed to reveal it only after the family had gathered." Henderson adjusted his spectacles. Mr. Avery, you do not currently have full ownership of this ranch. The room went silent. What do you mean? Colt's voice sounded distant to his own ears. Henderson read from the document. The heir named by Edna Greer must fulfill 3 conditions within 1 year of taking possession. First, restore the church that was lost to fire. Second, bring Samuel and Edna's 3 children to a state of reconciliation and familial peace. Third, restore the ranch to full productivity and prosperity. That's insane, Thomas said. You can't put conditions like that on a deed. Samuel Greer could and did. He owned the property free and clear. He had the legal right to attach any conditions he chose. What happens if the conditions aren't met? Margaret asked. The property reverts equally to the 3 children 1 year from the date Mrs. Greer signed the initial deed. Which means, Henderson consulted his notes, Mr. Avery has approximately 6 months remaining. The words hit Colt like a physical blow. 6 months. To rebuild a burned church with no money. To reconcile siblings who hadn't spoken in decades. To turn a struggling ranch profitable. It was impossible. This is manipulation, Thomas said, standing. Pure manipulation. Our father is forcing us to dance to his tune, even after death. Or giving us a chance, Rebecca said, her voice stronger now. A chance to heal. To be a family again. We're not a family. We're 3 people who share blood and nothing else. That's not true. Margaret stood, facing her brother. We were a family once. Maybe we could be again, on our father's terms, with some stranger orchestrating our reconciliation. Thomas gestured at Colt. No offense, Avery, but this is absurd. None taken, Colt said quietly. His mind was reeling, trying to process what he'd just learned. He'd been set up, not maliciously but definitively. He was a pawn in Samuel's grand plan, a tool for forcing his children back together. Mr. Avery, Henderson continued, you have the right to refuse these conditions and walk away. The property would immediately transfer to the 3 children, or you can attempt to fulfill the conditions. The choice is yours. Colt looked at the faces around the table. Thomas, angry and defensive. Margaret, hopeful but scared. Rebecca, quiet but watching him intently. And Edna, her ancient eyes filled with apology and determination. You knew, he said to Edna, when you gave me the ranch, you knew about these conditions. I did. Why didn't you tell me? Because you needed to see the land first, to feel called to it, to discover the church and read the letters. Her voice was steady despite her frailty. Samuel believed the right person would accept the mission, even knowing the cost. Was he wrong? The question hung in the air. Colt stood and walked to the window, looking out at the ranch he'd worked so hard to restore. 6 months of labor, of learning to hope again, of beginning to believe he had a home. And now this, he could walk away. Should walk away. This wasn't his family to fix, wasn't his responsibility to bear. He'd been manipulated, used, set up to fail at an impossible task. But even as the thoughts formed, he knew he wouldn't leave. The charred cross-beam flashed through his mind. Still standing, still bearing witness. Things could be broken and still serve a purpose. He thought of his own family, lost to fever, and how he'd give anything for a chance to heal those wounds, to have one more day, one more conversation. These 3 people had that chance, if they could set aside their pride and pain long enough to take it, and the church. The burned church that Samuel had loved, that had served a community that could serve again if someone had the courage to try. 6 months. It wasn't much time. Probably not enough, but maybe, just maybe, it was enough for grace to work. He turned back to face them. I have a question for the 3 of you. Do you want to try? Try what? Thomas asked. To be a family again. To honor your father's memory by at least attempting what he hoped for. 6 months. That's all. If we fail, you inherit the ranch and I walk away. But if we don't try, if we just give up before we start, we'll never know what might have been possible. This is emotional blackmail, Thomas said. No, Rebecca said softly. It's an opportunity. And I think I want to take it. She looked at her siblings. I've been writing to Mother for 5 years. Secret letters, because I was too proud to come home, but too lonely to stay completely away. She never stopped praying for us, never stopped hoping we'd find our way back to each other. Margaret reached for Rebecca's hand. I didn't know you were writing. I didn't tell anyone. I was ashamed of how much I still needed her, needed all of you. Rebecca's voice broke. I'm tired of being angry. I'm tired of the distance. I don't know if we can be a family again, but I'd like to try. Margaret, Colt asked gently, I want my children to know their grandmother before she's gone. I want them to know their aunts and uncle. She swallowed hard. I want to forgive my father. I don't know how, but I want to. All eyes turned to Thomas. He sat rigid, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Thomas, Edna said quietly, your father's last words were about you. He said to tell you that he was proud of you, that he always had been, even if he'd failed to show it. He said you were the best parts of him without the worst parts. He said he was sorry. Thomas's composure cracked. His face contorted, and he turned away, shoulders shaking. Margaret moved to him, put her hand on his back, and after a moment he let her. Colt waited, barely breathing. Finally, Thomas spoke, his voice rough. 6 months? 6 months, Colt confirmed. And if we fail? Then we fail having tried. That's more than most people get. Thomas turned back, his eyes red. I don't know if I can forgive him. That's okay, Colt said. Forgiveness is a journey, not a decision. We just have to start walking. Henderson cleared his throat. So, Mr. Avery, do you accept the conditions of the deed? Colt looked around the table one more time, at the broken family that might be healed, at the ranch that had become his home, at the impossible task that might just be divinely orchestrated. I do, he said. Not for the land, not for ownership, but because it's right. Because your father believed in restoration, and I think I want to believe in it too. Edna smiled, tears streaming down her aged face. Samuel said you would. He said the right person would choose the mission over the reward. Then I guess I'm the right person, Colt said, though his heart hammered with fear. 6 months to rebuild a church, 6 months to heal a family, 6 months to prove that grace could work through broken things. It was impossible, but then again, so was everything else God had ever done. All right, Colt said, squaring his shoulders. Let's get to work. The following morning, Colt laid Samuel's architectural plans across the dining table. He'd found them in the lawyer's documents, detailed drawings showing not just the church's original structure, but modifications and improvements Samuel had envisioned for the rebuild. The plans were meticulous, showing measurements, materials needed, even notes about where to source lumber and stone. But what struck Colt most were the handwritten annotations in the margins. Samuel had written theological reflections alongside the practical notes. The church is like Christ's body, broken but meant to be restored. Foundation must be solid, built on rock, not sand, just as faith must be. Windows facing east. We look toward the light even in darkness. The 3 Greer children gathered around the table, studying their father's handwriting with expressions of pain and wonder. He planned all this? Rebecca asked, tracing her finger over a notation. Years before he died? He believed it would happen, Colt said. Believed someone would come who'd be willing to try. Thomas picked up one of the sheets, his jaw tight. Of course he did. Always so certain about God's plans, even when his own family was falling apart. Thomas, Margaret started. No, let me say this. Thomas set the paper down carefully, as if it might shatter. You want to know why I'm so angry? It's not just that he missed my birthday or forgot to come to my school events. It's that he gave away money we needed. Money that could have expanded the ranch, hired more help, made Mother's life easier. But no, every time a family in the valley had trouble, there went our savings. Every time the church needed something, there went our security. He was trying to be generous, Margaret said softly. He was being reckless. We're his family. We should have come first. Rebecca spoke up, her voice steady but sad. You're not wrong, Thomas. But neither was he entirely. I left because I couldn't bear the weight of his expectations. Every sermon was about righteousness. Every conversation turned to scripture. I felt like I was constantly failing some test I didn't know I was taking. I needed a father who would just be present, not always teaching, always preaching, always trying to shape me into some spiritual ideal." Margaret nodded, tears sliding down her face. "He missed my wedding because the Henderson family lost their barn to fire. He was organizing a work crew, gathering supplies, and he just forgot the date. Forgot his own daughter's wedding." She wiped her eyes. "I know helping people is right. I know it's what Christians are supposed to do. But it felt like loving strangers was easier for him than loving us." The room fell silent. Colt let their words hang in the air, understanding that this was necessary. The wounds needed to be exposed before they could heal. "May I tell you my story?" he asked quietly. They looked at him, and he saw permission in their faces. 15 years ago, I had a wife, Sarah, and 2 children. Mary was 6, Thomas was 4. He saw young Thomas flinch at the shared name. "I was working the autumn roundup, good money, planning to buy us a better place. Sarah and the kids were staying in a borrowed cabin, waiting for me to finish the season." He paused, steadying himself. "This never got easier. Fever came through the camp. By the time word reached me and I got back, all 3 of them were dead, buried in a row under pine trees. I didn't get to say goodbye, didn't get to hold them one last time. Just graves." Margaret's hand went to her mouth. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. Even Thomas looked shaken. "I blamed God, blamed myself. Stopped praying, stopped believing that any of it mattered. I drifted for 3 years, working when I had to, drinking when I could afford it, wishing I could just stop waking up." Colt's voice was thick but steady. "Then one night I was sleeping in a barn and I heard singing. Hymns singing from a church down the road. And something in me just broke open. I walked to that church and sat in the back pew and cried through the whole service." He looked at each of them. "I tell you this because I understand being angry at someone you love. I was furious at God for years. But here's what I learned. Being angry doesn't mean you're wrong to feel it, but staying angry forever means you're choosing to carry poison. Your father failed you. That's true, but he also loved you, imperfectly but completely. And he's gone now, which means you have a choice. You can hold on to the anger, or you can try to build something new from the ruins." "Like the church," Rebecca said softly. "Like the church," Colt agreed. "Your father wrote that the church represents Christ's body, broken but meant to be restored. I think maybe families are the same way." Thomas stood abruptly and walked to the window, his back to them. When he spoke, his voice was rough. "What if we try and fail? What if we spend 6 months working together and we still can't forgive him?" "Can't forgive each other?" "Then at least you'll have tried," Colt said. "And that's something your father never got. The chance to make amends while everyone was still alive. You have that chance. Don't waste it." The silence stretched. Finally, Thomas turned around. "All right, 6 months. But I'm not promising anything except effort. That's all anyone can promise," Colt said. They spent the rest of the day planning. The church site needed to be cleared of debris, the foundation assessed for stability, materials sourced and transported. It was an enormous undertaking, far beyond what 4 people could accomplish alone. "We'll need help," Margaret said, studying the plans. "A work crew, skilled labor. I'll talk to Dutch Morrison," Colt said. "And Reverend Michaels. If we explain what we're trying to do, maybe others will want to be part of it." "Why would they help?" Thomas asked skeptically. "Because your father built that church for them the first time. Because people remember kindness, even imperfect kindness. Because," Colt paused, choosing his words carefully, "because I think folks want to believe in restoration, in second chances, in things that are broken being made whole again." Dutch Morrison was the first to commit. When Colt explained the project, the older rancher's eyes lit up. "About time someone did this. Samuel would be pleased. I'll donate timber from my land, and I'll put in 3 days a week of labor." Reverend Michaels was next, offering not just his own help, but organizing Sunday work parties. "We'll make it a community effort. The church served everyone. Everyone can help rebuild it." Word spread through the valley. Some people were skeptical, suspicious of Colt's motives or doubtful of the family's commitment. But others remembered Samuel's generosity, remembered the church before the fire, and they came with tools and willing hands. The work began in earnest. They rode to the church site in wagons loaded with supplies, and the reality of the task became overwhelming. The debris alone would take weeks to clear. The foundation needed extensive repair, and winter still held the high country in its grip, making every day's work a battle against cold and snow. The Greer siblings worked alongside Colt and the volunteers, and the old patterns of conflict emerged immediately. Thomas wanted to work methodically, following the plans exactly. Rebecca preferred a more intuitive approach, adjusting as they went. Margaret tried to mediate, but often ended up frustrated with both of them. "We're doing it Father's way," Thomas insisted during one heated argument. Maybe Father's way wasn't always right. Rebecca shot back, "So we're just going to ignore his plans." "I'm saying we should think for ourselves." Colt stepped between them, his voice calm but firm. "We're following the plans because they're good plans, but we adjust when the situation requires it. That's not abandoning your father's vision. That's honoring it with wisdom. Now, can we get back to work, or do you need to take a break?" They went back to work, but Colt could see the toll it was taking. Decades of hurt couldn't be healed in weeks, and the physical labor only intensified the emotional strain. Small breakthroughs came unexpectedly. One afternoon, Thomas and Rebecca were carrying a heavy beam together when Thomas slipped in the mud. Rebecca caught him, and for a moment they stood there, holding each other up, and then Rebecca laughed, a surprised, genuine sound. "You always were clumsy," she said. And it wasn't cruel, just sisterly. Thomas smiled despite himself. "Remember when I fell off the porch and landed in Mother's flower bed? Father was so angry. But Mother just laughed and said the flowers would grow back." They stood there, holding the beam, and something softened between them. Margaret found their father's Bible in the ruins one day, protected by some miracle in a metal box beneath where the altar had been. She opened it carefully and her breath caught. Inside were notes written to her in the margins, dated over the years. "Praying for Margaret today. So proud of my daughter. Lord, help me show her my love better." She brought it to Colt that evening, tears streaming down her face. "He thought about me. He prayed for me. I never knew he loved you," Colt said simply. "He just didn't know how to show it in ways you could receive it." Edna visited every week, driven by her sister, wrapped in heavy blankets despite the approaching spring. Her health was clearly failing, but her spirit remained strong. She'd sit on a folding chair and watch them work, occasionally calling out encouragement or gentle corrections. "You're doing well," she told Colt one afternoon. "All of you. We're trying," he said, sitting beside her during a break. "But it's hard. Some days I wonder if 6 months is enough. It has to be enough. I won't last much longer, Mr. Avery. I want to see them reconciled before I go. Miss Edna, it's all right. I'm 96 years old. I've had a long life, a good life, even with its sorrows. But I need to know my children will be all right, that they'll have each other." Spring arrived gradually, melting the snow and turning the worksite into a muddy challenge. They were making progress. The foundation was repaired, new walls were rising, the frame of the roof was taking shape. But then a late winter storm hit, bringing heavy snow and wind that collapsed part of the new construction. Colt arrived the next morning to find Thomas standing amid the wreckage, his face blank with despair. "It's over," Thomas said flatly. "We can't do this. 3 months of work destroyed in one night. We'll never finish in time." Margaret and Rebecca arrived and saw the damage. Margaret sank onto a log, her face in her hands. Rebecca stared at the collapsed walls, her jaw tight. Colt felt his own despair rising but pushed it down. He thought of the charred crossbeam, still standing despite everything. He thought of Sarah and his children, and how he'd give anything for one more chance with them. He thought of Samuel's letters, written in faith that someone would come. He climbed onto what remained of the platform and spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Listen to me, all of you. This storm destroyed 3 months of work, that's true. But it didn't destroy what we've built between us. Thomas, Rebecca, Margaret, 3 months ago you could barely stand to be in the same room. Now you're working together, talking together, starting to be a family again. That's worth more than any building. But the deadline," Margaret started, "we'll make it. We have 3 months left, and we have help, and we have each other. Your father built this church once, with nothing but faith and determination. We can rebuild it with the same, but only if we don't quit, only if we keep standing, even when the storms come. Because that's what faith is, standing when everything says to fall. He looked at each of them, seeing doubt and exhaustion and fear, but also something else, the faintest flicker of determination. So what do you say? Do we quit or do we keep building? Thomas was the first to move. He picked up a fallen beam and carried it to the side. We keep building. Rebecca joined him, then Margaret. And as the sun broke through the clouds, the community members who'd come to help began arriving. Seeing the damage and rolling up their sleeves without being asked, they worked until dark, clearing the debris, salvaging what they could, planning the repairs. And that night, sitting around a fire at the ranch, the three Greer siblings talked late into the evening, not about their father, not about the past, but about the future, about what they'd do when the church was finished. But maybe, possibly, finding their way back to being a family. Colt sat apart, listening, and felt something that might have been hope take root in his chest. 3 months left. It would be enough. It had to be enough, because grace, he was learning, wasn't about having enough time. It was about using the time you had to build something worth keeping. Spring settled over the valley, with surprising warmth, and the church rose from its ruins like something being born. The walls stood complete, the roof beams were in place, and volunteers worked daily on the finishing details. 3 months remained until the deadline, and by all external measures, they were going to make it. But Colt could feel the fractures forming beneath the surface. It started with a disagreement about the cross. Thomas wanted it placed exactly where it had been in the original church, following Samuel's plans to the letter. Rebecca argued that they should position it differently, allowing more light through the eastern windows. Margaret tried to compromise, suggesting they pray about it, which only frustrated both siblings. We're not children, Thomas snapped. We don't need to pray about every small decision. Maybe that's the problem, Rebecca shot back. Maybe if we'd prayed more as a family, we wouldn't have ended up broken. Don't blame our family's problems on a lack of prayer. Blame father's obsession with appearing spiritual while neglecting the practical needs of his children. The argument escalated, old wounds reopening with shocking speed. Margaret tried to intervene, but ended up taking Thomas's side, which left Rebecca feeling isolated and angry. Colt attempted to mediate, but Thomas turned on him. Who made you the authority here, Avery? You're not family. You're just the man my mother gave our inheritance to, and I still don't fully understand why. The words struck deeper than Thomas probably intended. Colt felt the familiar shame rising, the sense that he was an imposter, playing a role he had no right to claim. He'd been so focused on the physical work of rebuilding the church that he'd neglected the deeper work of healing the relationships. That evening, exhausted and discouraged, he rode to Edna's sister's house, where Edna was now bedridden, her body finally surrendering to age. She was awake when he arrived, propped up on pillows, her face gaunt, but her eyes still sharp. They're fighting, he told her without preamble, and I don't know how to fix it. Maybe I can't fix it. Maybe this whole thing was a mistake. Sit down, Mr. Avery. Her voice was weak but commanding. He sat. Tell me what happened. He explained the argument, his failure to mediate Thomas's accusation. When he finished, Edna was quiet for a long moment. You've been building a church, she said finally. But that was never the real mission. What do you mean? Samuel didn't want a building, Mr. Avery. He wanted his children to forgive him, to forgive each other, to remember how to be a family. The church was just a symbol, a shared project that would force them to work together, to face their pain, to talk about things they'd been avoiding for 20 years. Colt stared at her. So the building doesn't matter? It matters, but not as much as what's happening between them. Samuel's greatest regret wasn't the burned church, it was the burned bridges with his children. He loved them desperately, Mr. Avery, but he showed it through provision rather than presence. He gave them material security, but starved them of emotional connection. And he knew it. He died knowing it. What am I supposed to do? Stop focusing on finishing the building. Start focusing on finishing the healing. She reached for his hand with her papery grip. Bring them together. Make them talk. Make them remember not just the pain, but the love that came before the pain. Make them see each other as people, not just as representatives of old hurts. He sat with her until she fell asleep, then rode back to the ranch through the spring darkness. The house was empty. The siblings had gone to their separate accommodations in town, unable to bear each other's presence after the day's conflict. Colt stood in the parlor, looking at the items he'd collected over the months. Samuel's pocket watch on the mantel, the brand iron beside it, the letters carefully preserved in the study. And in the corner, wrapped in burlap, was the cornerstone that Samuel had carved before his death. They'd found it in the barn, waiting to be placed in the new church foundation. He unwrapped it and read the inscription by lamplight. Founded on faith, built by love, sustained by grace. The next morning, he sent word to all three siblings. Not a request, a summons. They arrived separately, wary and resistant, but they came. Colt had built up the fire in the hearth and moved chairs into a circle. In the center, he'd placed the cornerstone on a small table. "Sit down," he said when they tried to protest. "All of you now." Something in his tone made them obey. When they were seated, he stood before them. "We're done building for today. For this week if necessary. Because Miss Edna made me understand something. We've been building a church, while the real foundation, your family, is still crumbling. We're working together." Margaret started. "You're working next to each other." "That's not the same thing." Colt gestured to the cornerstone. "Your father carved this before he died. Founded on faith, built by love, sustained by grace." He was talking about the church, but he was also talking about family. "And right now, you don't have any of those three things binding you together. That's not fair," Thomas began. "I don't care about fair. I care about truth." Colt's voice was firm but not harsh. "You're about to inherit a ranch and a church, but if you can't stand to be in the same room without fighting, what's the point? You'll sell the property, go your separate ways, and spend the rest of your lives carrying the same pain you're carrying now." The silence was heavy. Rebecca looked at the floor. Margaret wiped tears from her eyes. Thomas sat rigid, his jaw clenched. "I'm going to ask you to do something difficult," Colt continued. "I want each of you to share one memory of your father that you cherish. Not the painful ones, you've shared plenty of those. One moment when you felt loved by him. When you knew, despite everything, that he cared." "I can't," Rebecca whispered. "You can, and you will. Because if you can't remember one moment of love, then you've let the pain erase everything good, and that's not honoring the truth." He looked at Thomas. "You're the eldest. You start." Thomas sat frozen, his face a mask of resistance. Then slowly something shifted. His shoulders lowered, his hands unclenched. "I was 7, he said quietly. "Maybe 8. Father was teaching me to ride. I kept falling off, and I was so frustrated I started crying. I thought he'd be disappointed, that he'd tell me to toughen up." He paused, his voice thickening. "But he didn't. He sat down in the dirt with me and said, 'Son, everything worth doing is hard at first. But I believe in you, and I'll be here every time you fall until you learn to stay on.' And he was. Every day for 2 weeks he worked with me, patient, proud, present." Margaret made a small sound, and Thomas looked at her. "I'd forgotten that," he said, wonder in his voice. "I'd completely forgotten, Margaret," Colt prompted gently. She wiped her eyes and smiled through tears. "He couldn't sing, just absolutely terrible. But every morning while he did chores, he'd sing hymns at the top of his lungs. Mother would laugh and tell him he was scaring the chickens, but he'd just sing louder. And sometimes," her voice broke, "sometimes he'd grab her and dance with her right there in the barn, both of them laughing, and he'd look so happy. So completely ridiculously happy." Rebecca was crying now, silent tears sliding down her face. "Rebecca," Colt said gently. She looked up, her face wet with tears, and took a shuddering breath. "He was dying. The doctor had given him days, maybe a week. Mother sent telegrams to all of us, begging us to come home." Her voice was barely audible. "I wrote back to Thomas and Margaret. I told them we needed to go, that we needed to see him one last time, to say goodbye, to—" She broke off. covering her face with her hands. "We didn't come," Thomas said, his voice hollow with realization. "God help us, we didn't come. I was too angry," Margaret whispered. "I told myself he'd made his choices, that he'd chosen everyone else over us our whole lives, that I didn't owe him my presence at the end." Rebecca lowered her hands, her face ravaged by grief. "Mother wrote me one final letter. She said his last words were, 'Tell them I'm sorry. Tell them I loved them poorly but completely.' She said he died, hoping we'd find our way home to each other, even if we couldn't find our way home to him." The words fell into the room like stones into still water, sending ripples of pain through all of them. Thomas was the first to break. The rigid control he'd maintained for months, for years, simply shattered. His face contorted, and a sound came from him that was almost inhuman. Decades of suppressed grief finally finding voice. His shoulders shook with sobs that seemed torn from somewhere deep and broken inside him. Margaret went to him first, wrapping her arms around her brother, and she was crying too, both of them holding each other with the desperation of people drowning. Rebecca joined them, and suddenly all three were locked together, weeping, their grief finally given permission to exist. Colt stepped back, giving them space, his own eyes burning with tears. This was what needed to happen. This was the real work. Not building walls, but breaking down the walls they'd built around their hearts. They cried until they had nothing left, until the well of pain had been emptied, and all that remained was exhaustion and something that might have been peace. As the first light of dawn crept through the windows, they sat together on the floor, leaning against each other, too tired to move. "We have to finish the church," Thomas said finally, his voice hoarse. "Not because of the deadline or the inheritance, but for him, for us, to prove that broken things can be restored." "Together," Margaret said, taking his hand. "Together," Rebecca agreed. Taking her sister's other hand, Colt felt something release in his chest, a weight he hadn't known he was carrying. They were going to make it. Not because the building would be finished, but because the family was being rebuilt. A knock at the door interrupted the moment. Edna's sister stood there, her face grave. "She's gone," she said simply. "Just now, peacefully in her sleep. She asked me to tell you," her voice caught, "that she was proud of all of you. That Samuel would be proud. That she could rest now." The news should have devastated them, but instead it felt like grace. Edna had held on just long enough to see her children come back together. She'd waited until the reconciliation she'd prayed for had begun. And then, her mission complete, she'd let go. The funeral 3 days later brought the entire valley together. People came from towns 50 miles away, remembering Edna's kindness, Samuel's generosity, the church that had once served them all. The Greer children stood together at the graveside, united in their grief and love. Thomas spoke first, his voice steady despite emotion. "My mother loved imperfectly but completely, just like my father. She gave everything she had to see her family restored, including her final months, orchestrating this impossible mission. I'm grateful—" His voice broke, then steadied. "I'm grateful she lived to see us come back together." Margaret read from Psalms, her voice clear and strong. Rebecca simply stood with her hand on the casket, silent tears streaming down her face, saying goodbye to the mother she'd reconnected with too late, but in time enough. Colt spoke last, at their request. "Miss Edna showed me mercy on a trail when I was nobody, just a broken man with nothing to his name. She saw past what I was to what I could become. That's grace, seeing the possible in the impossible, believing in restoration when everyone else sees only ruin. She gave me a home, a purpose, and a family I didn't know I needed. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that gift." After the funeral, they returned to the church site with renewed purpose. What had been obligation became mission. What had been conflict became collaboration. The Greer siblings worked side by side, not perfectly. Old patterns didn't disappear overnight, but with patience and grace when tensions arose. Dutch Morrison and Reverend Michaels organized the final push. The whole community seemed to rally, sensing something important was happening beyond just rebuilding a structure. Families brought meals to feed the workers. Children helped carry supplies. Even the skeptics who doubted Colt's motives found themselves caught up in the spirit of restoration. The day came to lay the cornerstone. They gathered at the foundation, the three siblings, Colt, the Reverend, and representatives from every family in the valley. Thomas carried the carved stone, Margaret read from the family Bible, and Rebecca offered a prayer that moved everyone to tears. Before they set the stone in place, Colt stepped forward with something in his hand, a simple gold wedding band. "Edna asked me to do this," he said, showing them the ring. "She said it represented covenant love, love that endures beyond death, beyond failure, beyond all the ways we fall short. She wanted it built into the altar, a reminder that the church is founded on love that doesn't quit." They placed the ring in a small depression, carved into the cornerstone, then sealed it with mortar. As the stone was lowered into place, completing the foundation, Colt felt the weight of the mission settling into something solid and sure. The final weeks passed in a blur of purposeful labor. The windows were installed, flooding the interior with colored light. The pews were built and placed. The cross was raised, positioned exactly where Samuel had planned it, a compromise that felt right to everyone. The bell tower received Samuel's bell, the one he'd commissioned but never installed. As spring gave way to early summer, the church stood complete. Not perfect, they'd run out of funds for some of the finishing touches Samuel had envisioned, but whole, functional, beautiful in its simplicity. The three Greer children stood in the sanctuary one evening, looking at what they'd built together. "He would have loved this," Margaret said softly. "He did love it," Thomas replied. "He saw it before we did. That was his gift, seeing what could be, even when it seemed impossible." "I forgive him," Rebecca said suddenly. "I don't know when it happened, but somewhere in these months of working together, remembering together, grieving together, I let go of the anger. I forgive him for being human and imperfect. And I forgive myself for not coming home when he was dying." "I forgive him too," Margaret said. They looked at Thomas, waiting. He stood silent for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I forgive him, and I forgive us for being too stubborn to reconcile while we had the chance. But we have a chance now, with each other. Let's not waste it." They embraced, and Colt watched from the doorway, knowing his work was nearly done. The church was built. The family was restored. All that remained was the dedication, and then what? He'd been so focused on the mission that he hadn't thought about what came after. The ranch would revert to the siblings. He'd walk away with nothing but the satisfaction of having completed what Samuel had started. It should have felt like loss, but it didn't. It felt like exactly what was meant to happen. He'd been a tool in God's hands, and the work was good. That would have to be enough. The morning of the dedication arrived exactly 1 year to the day after Edna had signed the ranch deed over to Colt. The church stood on the hillside overlooking the valley, simple but beautiful in the early summer light. Wagons and riders had been arriving since dawn, people streaming in from every corner of the territory to witness what many had thought impossible. Colt stood on the ranch porch, watching the procession, and marveled at how much had changed. The church wasn't just rebuilt, it was transformed, better than it had been before the fire. And the three Greer children, who'd arrived as strangers to each other, now stood together, greeting guests with genuine warmth. Thomas had resigned from his position in Chicago and moved back to Montana, taking a room in town but spending most days at the ranch. Margaret visited monthly, bringing her husband and grandchildren, filling the house with laughter and life. Rebecca had taken the room Colt had originally chosen for himself, helping manage the ranch and teaching at the small school that had reopened in the valley. They'd become family, not perfect, still navigating old wounds, but family nonetheless. Colt dressed in the new suit they'd insisted on buying him, feeling like an imposter in the fine clothes, but grateful for the gesture. He rode to the church with the siblings, Maud trotting alongside as always, unwilling to be left behind even for a ceremony. The church was packed, standing room only, when Reverend Michaels called for quiet. But before the service could begin, Mr. Henderson, the lawyer, stepped forward. "Before we dedicate this beautiful building," he said, "there's legal business to conclude. Mr. Avery, would you join me?" Colt walked forward, his heart hammering. This was it, the moment when the conditions would be assessed, when Henderson would declare whether he'd succeeded or failed. The terms set forth by Samuel Greer were clear. Henderson announced to the gathered crowd. First, restore the church. As we can all see, this condition has been magnificently fulfilled. Applause rippled through the congregation. Second, bring the 3 Greer children to reconciliation and familial peace. I've spoken with Thomas, Margaret, and Rebecca, and they've confirmed that this condition, too, has been met. More applause. Louder this time. Third, restore the ranch to productivity and prosperity. The ranch is thriving under Mr. Avery's stewardship, supporting livestock and beginning to show profit. All 3 conditions have been fulfilled within the allotted time. Henderson turned to Colt. "Mr. Avery, as of this moment, you are the full and legal owner of the Greer Ranch, with all rights and privileges thereto." The crowd erupted in cheers, but Colt felt a strange emptiness. He'd done it, fulfilled the impossible mission, but at what cost? The siblings would lose the ranch that should have been their inheritance. They'd worked beside him all these months, reconciled and healed, only to watch him claim the prize. He raised his hand for quiet. "Thank you, Mr. Henderson, but I have something to say before we proceed." He reached into his coat and pulled out papers he'd prepared in secret over the past weeks. "Working with Henderson without telling anyone what he was doing. I came to Montana with nothing," Colt said, his voice carrying across the hushed church. "A drifter with a limp and a donkey, no prospects, no hope. Miss Edna gave me mercy when I needed it most. She gave me a home, a purpose, and," he looked at the 3 siblings, "a family. But this ranch was never meant to be mine alone. Your father's mission wasn't to give me property. It was to bring you home to each other, and to the legacy he left you." He held up the papers. "These are new deed transfers, properly drawn up and witnessed. I'm dividing the ranch into 4 equal shares, 1 for me, 1 for each of you. Your father wanted you to have an inheritance, but he wanted you to earn it through love, not just receive it through blood. You've done that. This land belongs to all of us now." The siblings stared at him, stunned. Thomas recovered first. "We can't accept that. You fulfilled the conditions, and part of fulfilling them was learning what your father already knew. Family is worth more than property. I'm not giving this up. I'm sharing it. The way it should have been from the start." Margaret was crying, Rebecca's hand over her mouth in shock. Thomas shook his head in wonder. "You're either the most foolish man I've ever met," Thomas said, "or the wisest. I honestly can't tell which. Maybe both," Colt said with a slight smile. "Do you accept?" They didn't answer with words. They simply embraced him, all 3 at once. This strange family they'd become. And the church erupted in applause and cheers. The dedication service that followed was one of the most beautiful things Colt had ever experienced. Reverend Michaels spoke about restoration and second chances. The Greer children each shared memories of their parents, their voices steady with love and forgiveness. And when it came time for the church bell to ring for the first time, Thomas climbed the tower and pulled the rope. The sound rolled across the valley like a blessing, clear and strong, calling people home, calling them to worship, to community, to the work of loving each other despite imperfection. Colt stood listening with his eyes closed, feeling the vibrations in his chest, and thought of Samuel's vision, this moment, this sound, this impossible restoration made real. After the service, they returned to the ranch for a celebration. Tables were set up in the yard, food spread out in abundance, people laughing and talking as the sun moved across the sky. Colt found himself standing with Dutch Morrison, both of them watching the festivities. "Samuel would be proud," Dutch said. "You did what he couldn't do. I just did what needed doing. The rest was grace. That's the same thing, isn't it?" Maybe it was. As evening approached and guests began departing, the 4 of them, Colt, Thomas, Margaret, and Rebecca, sat on the ranch porch in comfortable silence. Maud grazed nearby, content and peaceful, and Colt smiled, thinking about how far they'd come together. "We need to talk about next steps," Thomas said. "There are families in the valley struggling. The Hendersons lost their barn last month. The Parkers' well went dry. I was thinking we could help them, Rebecca finished. Offer work, maybe let them lease some of the land until they're back on their feet. Your father would like that, Colt said. Continuing his legacy of generosity. Our father, Margaret corrected gently. You're part of this family now, Colt. Whether you planned it or not. He felt emotion rise in his throat. Family. He'd lost his first family to fever, thought he'd never have another. But here it was, imperfect, assembled from broken pieces. But real nonetheless. He pulled out his worn Bible, the one that had traveled with him through all his wandering years, and opened it to a passage he'd marked long ago. The same passage Samuel had underlined in his own Bible. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. Your father underlined this too, he said, showing them the page. I think he understood that God works through broken things, that being crushed doesn't mean being destroyed, that the most beautiful restorations come from the deepest ruins. They sat in silence as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. The church stood on the hillside, its windows beginning to glow with lamplight as the Reverend prepared for evening prayers. The ranch spread out before them, healthy and thriving, land that had chosen its keepers as much as they'd chosen it. Thank you, Thomas said suddenly, for not giving up on us, for seeing what we could become when we couldn't see it ourselves. That's what mercy looks like, Colt replied. Someone believing in you before you deserve it. Someone giving you what you need rather than what you've earned. Your mother taught me that on a trail 1 year ago. I'm just passing it forward. As full darkness fell, they remained on the porch, talking about plans and dreams and the future they'd build together. They'd open the church for regular services, with Reverend Michaels presiding. They'd work the ranch as partners, combining their different strengths. They'd help struggling families the way Samuel had. But this time with the balance Samuel had struggled to find, generosity tempered with wisdom. Charity that didn't neglect family. Before they went inside, Colt stood at the porch rail one last time, looking toward the church on the hill. A single light burned in the bell tower, a beacon visible for miles. He thought of Sarah and his children, their memories no longer quite so painful. He thought of Samuel and Edna, whose impossible vision had come to pass. He thought of the journey that had brought him here, from drifter to landowner, from broken to healing, from solitary to surrounded by family. Thank you, he whispered, a prayer spoken to the night sky. Not just for the land, but for the people. Not just for the home, but for the family. Not just for survival, but for purpose. Thank you for using broken things to build something beautiful. The church bell rang once, the evening call to prayer, and its sound carried across the valley like an answer. Like a blessing, like grace made audible. Colt smiled and went inside, where his family was waiting. Behind him, Maud settled into her stall. The ranch rested under stars, and the church stood watch over the valley. Everything was exactly as it should be. Everything was finally beautifully home.